this lesson, we will look into a specific case study which can help understand how envisioning processes can support inclusive urban transformations in contexts of vulnerability and marginality. These tools are relevant for opening new perspectives for urban transformation. We will delve into an action research and action learning experience. More specifically, we will focus on the intensive and immersive workshop led by KU Leuven entitled Designing Inclusion. This was held in Guayaquil, Ecuador, in 2015 and served as a launchpad for a number of follow-up initiatives which are still underway. Guayaquil is Ecuador's largest city and seaport. It is located in a very fragile estuarine landscape at the confluence of the Guayas and Babahoyo rivers. In the 1960s, the growing number of newcomers to the city had little choice but to settle within this vulnerable landscape, continuously reshaping the border between the mangroves and the city. The settlement began as housing on stilts, with no basic services, and with residents spending much effort into the transformation of water into land. After 5 decades, what was once an aquatic landscape had been transformed into consolidated urban fabric and forms part of the neighborhood called Suburbia. Since inception, the families living in this area have had to struggle for accessing urban welfare and resources. The recent makeover of the city, known as Guayaquil Ecológico, has planned linear parks along the urban edges in order to prevent further expansion into the estuary. Moreover, evictions and forced relocation have occurred in parts of Suburbia expected to host the new park system. This has led to extreme polarization between local communities and the authorities implementing the project. Several community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, and higher education institutions have become involved, mostly as advocates of neighborhood organizations and their anti-eviction plight, opposing the park's realization. The Action Learning Workshop involved 50 participants who formed teams based on the advantages of combining multiple geographic origins and professional experiences. Each team focused on different sites in order to cover as many representative conditions as possible. Envisioning started by assuming that 2 major shifts could be integrated into the future transformation of Suburbia. Firstly, that the ecological ambitions of the government would not be given up, but could be reframed in order to avoid families from losing their homes. And secondly, that the content of the Guayaquil Ecológico project could be revised in order to integrate the provision of other social and cultural resources, while at the same time responding more efficiently to the area's environmental challenges. To reach these assumptions, action learners and researchers spent several hours in the field. They engaged in deep listening, a core discipline of envisioning processes, in order to discern concerns. Deep listening is indeed already part of imagining the future. The search for a shared vision requires persons who, by listening, can nurture, clarify, and critique the various images of the future that are advanced by multiple voices. Workshop participants, therefore, met with several specialists and experts who had been engaged in the formulation of the project, as well as with families residing in Suburbia or that had been evicted. In this process, most participants became advocates of the least heard voices. Part of the deep listening and learning was engendered through a situated understanding obtained by means of social mapping. To build exploratory scenarios, data is necessary, since scenarios are premised on the radicalization of certain phenomena to harness present imaginations. By starting from what is recognized as objective by various participants in the present, they rely on different forms of data. For this reason, information from above would be confronted with information from below. To gain insight in the latter, the action researchers compiled several maps of their sites. These embedded a number of layers that transcended technical information such as hydrological conditions, soil types, and topography but also included information on extended family networks and related space-sharing arrangements. By being in close contact with these families, workshop participants also discovered that several neighborhood organizations had mobilized to regenerate their collective spaces. They also had begun to discuss proposals based on the idea that living in an estuarine landscape could be possible. However, they failed to recognize that the area was increasingly subject to climate change-induced risks, such as flash floods. In the course of a multi-stakeholder gathering, the various teams presented a number of exploratory scenarios. Exploratory scenarios differ from normative ones by focusing on images developed to achieve possible futures, and not just desirable ones. They therefore produce images of the future which can be linked to various stakeholders. These images and links were discussed at the University of Guayaquil, which was perceived as a neutral space by the local communities and the authorities, and facilitated a non-judgmental attitude with regard to the images being produced. Moreover, local communities which had felt neglected in their needs and aspirations felt acknowledged. The choice of the venue proved to be a crucial setting for enabling a less polarized discussion on the possible futures of the Suburbia. This was a crucial step to share contrasting images about the future and thus, by means of their juxtaposition, work towards a shared vision for the future. The scenarios differed from site to site. Some were more radical in taking certain phenomena such as climate change to its extreme consequences. Some other imaging focused instead on the construction of an alternative narrative of the area's development and transformation. Suburbia's residents were no longer the harmful invaders of the estuary, but its custodians. This could help support another kind of linear park, where leisure landscapes were intertwined with productive ones, in order to reinforce existing livelihoods and promote new ones. Scenarios did not only visualize possible images of the future, but by juxtaposing and synthesizing them through visualization, they fostered the terrain for exchange between participants. The debate that ensued was not always simple. The well-organized communities were well-versed in advancing their views concerning their site area, but this was not the case for less socially cohesive ones. Public authorities were often dismissive and defensive, whereas the UG faculty was not consistently committed. One of the most evident results of the first encounter, however, was that the various community groups from Suburbia understood that their struggle was not isolated. This set the premise for a shared vision, which was not simply a compendium of all the various site-specific scenarios, but that considered Suburbia as a larger entity they were part of within the metropolitan area of Guayaquil. It was a tangible visualization that synthesized images of the future that had been selected during the polylogue, formed an alternative to the Guayaquil Ecológico. The second week was devoted to further fieldwork, to refine and enrich the envisioning process. Most efforts went into further deep listening and mapping. This included collecting information from personal and public archives to produce images which could unfold the history of the Suburbio and of its hosting environment. This gathering of images would help the visualization process that supports envisioning by selecting and articulating the multiple representations which have defined cities and territories, with special care for the less documented or neglected narratives. The teams also engaged in a focused imaging exercise by making postcards from the future. This technique is based on selecting a moment in time that belongs to the imagined future from which to write back to the present. The postcard, consisting of one image and an associated message, helps explain how that future would be like. This becomes a means to share future projections in a way that is very different from the technocratic master planning based, for the large part, on unrealistic norms and standards. This method of imaging and visualization shows how the future can be felt as possible, and by means of a commonly used output, that of the postcard, makes that future feel less out of reach. The inclusion on the postcard of a written message creates an immediate sense of plausibility and proximity. Discussion was then brought back to the Suburbio in order to engage with other residents. This did not only allow more outreach, but also expanded the conversation further. Scenarios were projected on the walls of neighborhood organizers' homes. A second meeting with various stakeholders was held once again at the University of Guayaquil. This was accompanied by an exhibit of site-specific materials generated for each site. The workshop ended with the following. Firstly, local communities all received a printed version of the images used for discussion as a basis for them to continue formulating options for on-site upgrading. On the other hand, the University of Guayaquil staff involved in the workshop committed to support the threatened communities by further participation. To conclude, through envisioning, vulnerable residents felt voiced not so much in their anger, but especially in the possibility of their narrative being included when understanding the complexity of a site. This meant that, while starting from a polarized conflict, a polylogue between different parties became possible. Imaging could base itself on several sources, and by connecting past, present, and future by means of different outputs, created a fruitful terrain for considering a more inclusive urban transformation.